The air in the Great Hall of Vienna felt different. It wasn't just air. It was thick with history, with the ghosts of 1,000 perfect performances. For a young woman named Anja, sitting in one of the plush red velvet seats, it felt like she was breathing in water. Every breath was an effort, heavy and slow. Her hands, usually her greatest asset, felt clumsy and foreign in her lap, damp with a sweat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She wiped them discreetly on her dress, simple navy blue dress that now felt painfully plain amongst the silk and finery around her. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs, a frantic, nervous beat that drowned out the quiet, respectful murmur of the crowd. This was it. The moment she had dreamed of, and the moment she was terrified of. Anja was not from this world of gleaming marble and gold leaf. She came from a small town where the loudest sound was the factory whistle. And the idea of making a life with music was met with confused looks and gentle pats on the back. Her family hadn't been unsupportive. Not really, but they hadn't understood. They saw her piano as an expensive hobby, a noisy one at that. They couldn't comprehend the way the notes could stitch together the broken parts of her soul. How a chord progression could tell a story words couldn't capture. Her journey to this hall had started on a rickety, second-hand upright piano that had a sticky C-sharp key. She had learned to work around it, to incorporate its slight hesitation into her music. A tiny flaw that made the sound uniquely hers. She had practiced for thousands of hours in a small room with paper-thin walls. While her neighbors banged on the ceiling and her parents worried about her future, every sacrifice, every lonely night, every missed party with friends had led to this single chair. In this impossible room, all around her, the whispers were about him, the maestro. His name was spoken like a prayer and a curse all at once. People leaned towards each other, their voices low and conspiratorial. They say he can hear a single wrong note from the back of the balcony. An elderly woman with pearls whispered to her companion. He doesn't just teach, he dissects, a stern-looking man in a dark suit commented to his notebook. Anja had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in her world had. They were legends passed down from one generation of music students to the next. He was a genius, a titan, a god of the 88 keys. But he was also a monster. He was famous for stopping students mid-phrase, for his withering critiques that could shatter a person's confidence in a single sentence. There was a story about a boy from Japan who had flown across the world for this opportunity, only to be told by the maestro that he played with the passion of a vending machine. The boy had reportedly never played in public again. The stakes were not just about getting a good review, they were about survival. Anja looked down at the sheet music in her lap. The pages were soft and worn at the edges from years of use. The notes were not just black dots on a page to her. They were a map of her life. Each crescendo marked a small victory, each rest a moment of doubt she had overcome. She had chosen a piece that was technically difficult. But more than that, it was a piece that required a piece of the performer's soul to be given to the audience. It was a risk. A safe, clean performance might impress him technically, but it wouldn't move him. A passionate performance might leave her open to his most brutal criticism. She was caught between two kinds of fear, the fear of failing, and the far greater fear of succeeding but not being good enough. Suddenly, a hush fell over the hall. A wave of silence that started at the front and rolled back until everyone was holding their breath. A man in a sharp tuxedo walked onto the stage and approached the microphone. He was the director of the conservatory, and his face was a mixture of pride and anxiety. He spoke a few formal words in German, welcoming everyone and introducing the masterclass. Anja didn't understand all the words, but she understood the weight of them. Then, the director looked down at his list, and Anja's entire world shrank to the sound of his voice. He read out a name. It was her name. The sound of it, spoken so clearly in this sacred space, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her body. For a second, she couldn't move. Her legs were lead, her feet glued to the floor. Then, she felt a gentle nudge from the person sitting next to her, a kind smile encouraging her forward. It was enough to break the spell. She stood up on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. The walk to the stage was the longest journey of her life. Each step was an effort. The aisle seemed to stretch on forever, a canyon of staring eyes. She could feel every gaze on her, the curious, the pitying, the jealous, the hopeful. She tried to keep her head up, to look confident, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. The lights from the stage grew brighter and brighter, blinding her. She could no longer see the faces in the audience, only a dark, silent void. It was a relief. She climbed the 3 short steps onto the stage, her shoes making soft, clopping sounds that seemed to echo in the deafening silence. And there it was. The grand piano, it was a beautiful black beast, gleaming under the spotlights. It looked perfect, majestic, and terrifying. It was everything her old piano at home was not. This piano had no flaws, no sticky keys, no history of her struggles. It was a blank slate, and it was waiting for her to either conquer it or be humiliated by it. She walked over to the bench, her movements feeling stiff and robotic. She sat down, adjusting the seat's height automatically, a motion she had done 1,000,000 times before. She placed her sheet music on the stand, her fingers trembling slightly. For a moment, she just sat there, her back to the silent hall. She closed her eyes, blocking out the light, the pressure, the fear. She thought of her sticky C-sharp key back home. She thought of the way the music felt when it was just her and the sound in a room where no one was judging. She took one last deep, shaky breath and placed her fingers on the cool, smooth ivory keys. The silence in the hall was so complete, it felt like a physical presence. It was waiting. Anja opened her eyes. The first few notes of the piece hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Her fingers, usually so sure and connected to her thoughts, felt like they belonged to someone else, a stranger who was nervous and awkward. The sound that came out was small and thin, not the full, rich voice she knew the piano was capable of. It was the sound of her fear. She tried to push it down, to find the courage she had felt in her practice room back home. She pictured the worn keys of her old upright, the way she could pour her whole heart into it without anyone listening. But this was different. This hall was a giant, and every note she played was judged. The pressure was a physical weight on her shoulders, making them hunch forward. She fought to find the rhythm, to connect with the emotion of the music. The piece was about a storm, a great, powerful struggle of nature. It needed to be bold and dramatic. But her playing was hesitant. She was thinking too much, worrying about every single note, every possible mistake. It was like trying to walk across a frozen lake, terrified of falling through the ice at any moment. The music flowed, but it was a weak, trickling stream instead of a raging river. She could feel the disconnect between the passion in her heart and the nervousness in her hands. It was a war, and the fear was winning. She glanced up for a split second at the maestro, who was sitting perfectly still, his face like a stone carving. She couldn't read him at all, and that was almost worse than an angry look. His blankness was a void, and she was falling into it. She pushed forward, trying to put more force into a crescendo, to build the sound the way the composer intended. Her fingers moved a little faster, a little more confidently, but it was too late. The damage was done. The beginning of the piece was lost, a timid, shaky start that she could never get back. She was just about to transition into a softer, more delicate passage, a moment of calm before the next storm, when it happened. A sound like a gunshot shattered the music. It was a sharp, angry rap that echoed through the silent hall. The maestro had rapped his knuckles on the small table next to him, so hard that it sounded like wood cracking. The music died instantly. Anja's hands froze on the keys, her fingers hovering over the ivory. The sudden silence was more shocking than the noise had been. It was a different kind of silence now. Not reverent, but shocked. Cold. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. 100 heads turned to look at the maestro, then back at her. She could feel their collective gaze like a spotlight, hotter and brighter than the stage lights. Her throat went dry. Her heart, which had been beating fast before, now felt like it had stopped completely. "Stop," the maestro commanded. His voice was not loud, but it carried an incredible weight, an authority that cut through the tension. Just stop. He rose from his chair. He didn't hurry. He moved like a man who owned every inch of the room, his steps slow and deliberate. He walked down the aisle from his table towards the stage, and the crowd seemed to part for him. Anja watched him come, a feeling of pure dread washing over her. This was it. This was the moment all the stories were about. She was the next cautionary tale. He climbed the stairs onto the stage and walked towards her. He didn't look at her face, but at her hands, still frozen on the keys. He circled the piano slowly, like a shark. "No," he said, more to himself than to her. "This will not do." He finally stopped beside her, so close she could feel the heat from his body and smell the faint scent of cologne and old paper. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw his eyes up close. They were a pale, icy blue, and they held no pity, only disappointment. "You are not playing music," he said, his voice low, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You are typing. You are pressing buttons. There is no life here." He gestured to the piano with a dismissive wave of his hand. "This piece, it is a scream. It is a fight for your life in the middle of a hurricane. You are playing it like you are asking for permission to use the bathroom." A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Anja's face began to burn, a hot, prickling heat that started in her chest and rose up her neck. She wanted to look away, to disappear, but she was frozen in place. "It is empty," he continued, his voice getting a little louder, more like a lecturer addressing a dull student. "There is no heart in this. No story. No pain. It is a perfect collection of correct notes, and it is completely dead. You have learned the notes, but you have not learned the music. You have not felt it." He then did something that made Anja's stomach drop. He gestured to the bench. "Move," he said. It was not a request. Anja scrambled to her feet, her legs feeling weak and shaky. She stood to the side, feeling like a child who had been scolded. The maestro sat down on the bench, his back straight and commanding. He placed his own large hands on the keys. "You see," he said, addressing the audience now, "she plays this passage." And he played the exact same sequence of notes she had just attempted. But he turned it into a joke. He made the notes sound clumsy and robotic, like a child's toy piano. He exaggerated every tiny mistake she had made, turning her nervous hesitation into a ridiculous, comical stumble. He played it with a smirk on his face, and a few people in the audience couldn't help it. A small, nervous laugh escaped their lips, followed by another. The sound of their laughter was a physical blow to Anja. It was the sound of her public failure. The maestro stopped playing, and the short, mocking melody hung in the air. He then turned to her, his expression one of theatrical pity. "This is what you sound like," he said. "This is what you are giving to us." A joke. He stood up, leaving the bench empty again. He looked at her, his eyes cold. "Now, sit. And maybe, if you are capable of it, show us that there is a person inside that frightened little girl. Show us some feeling. Or just leave. You are wasting our time." He walked back to his seat without a backward glance. The entire hall was silent, but it was a heavy, suffocating silence filled with pity and embarrassment. Anja felt like she was standing naked in front of all these people. The shame was so intense, it was nauseating. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She wanted to run, to sprint off the stage and out of the hall and never come back. Every part of her was screaming at her to flee. She slowly walked back to the piano, her movements stiff with humiliation. She sat down, her body trembling. She looked at the keys, but they were blurred by the tears that were now welling up in her eyes. She had never felt so small, so worthless in her entire life. This was worse than failing. This was being a joke. This was having her dream, the one thing she truly loved, thrown back in her face like garbage. The silence that followed the maestro's return to his seat was a living thing. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the air, pressing down on Anja's shoulders until she felt she might collapse. The world had shrunk to the small circle of light on the stage, and she was at its center, a specimen under a microscope. Her face was on fire, a burning heat that she was sure everyone could see, a bright red beacon of her failure. Her hands trembled violently where they rested in her lap, and she clenched them into fists, trying to stop the shaking, but it was no use. The tremors ran up her arms, a physical echo of the chaos inside her. For a long moment she couldn't think. Her mind was a blank wall of white noise, a scream with no sound. All she could feel was the shame. It was a poison seeping into every part of her, twisting her insides. The maestro's words replayed in her head, not as sentences, but as sharp, jagged little stones. A joke. Wasting our time. Frightened little girl. Each word was a fresh wound. He had seen right through her. He had looked past the correct notes and the practiced technique and seen the terrified girl underneath, the one who was just pretending to belong here. He had exposed her in front of everyone, and now they all knew. They all knew she was a fraud. The urge to run was overwhelming, a primal, desperate need to escape. She pictured herself standing up, stumbling away from the piano, not even bothering to bow, just running and running until she couldn't hear the silence anymore, until she could find a dark corner to disappear into. That was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing, to just end this nightmare. But her feet were lead, her body frozen to the bench. She was trapped, a butterfly pinned to a card. Her wings torn, she slowly lifted her head, her gaze unfocused, and looked out into the dark void of the audience. She couldn't see individual faces, just a mass of shadows. But she could feel their eyes. She could feel the waves of pity washing over her, and it was almost worse than the mockery. Pity was a confirmation of her failure. It meant they saw her as a victim, as someone to be felt sorry for. She had not come all this way, had not sacrificed so much to be pitied. She thought of her journey again, the long, lonely road that had led her here. The hours of practice while her friends were out having fun, the extra jobs she had taken to pay for lessons, the hope in her parents' confused eyes. It all flashed before her, a highlight reel of her life's effort. And it all seemed to culminate in this one crushing moment of public humiliation. It had all been for nothing. The maestro was right. She was wasting everyone's time. Most of all, she was wasting her own. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, angry at herself for being so weak. She looked down at her hands, resting on her lap. They were the hands of a pianist, with long, slender fingers. But right now, they felt useless. They were the hands of a frightened little girl. And then, something strange happened. As she stared at her own hands, a memory surfaced, so clear and vivid it was like she was there. She was back in her small room at home, sitting at her old, rickety upright piano. The afternoon sun was streaming through the dusty window, lighting up the dance of dust motes in the air. She was playing just for herself, not for a teacher or an audience. She was playing a simple melody, one she had made up, and she was smiling. She remembered the feeling of the worn wooden keys under her fingers, the way the sticky C-sharp key had become part of the music, a little quirk that made it hers. In that memory, there was no fear. There was no judgment. There was only the pure, simple joy of making a sound that was beautiful to her. That was why she started playing. Not for fame, not for approval, but for that feeling. That quiet moment of connection between her heart and her hands and the sound. The memory was like a single match struck in a dark room. It was a small light, but it was enough. A quiet thought, barely a whisper, rose up from the depths of her despair. He doesn't know about that. The maestro. With his icy eyes and his sharp tongue, he didn't know about her dusty room or her sticky key, or the joy she felt when no one was listening. He could judge this performance, this terrified girl on this stage, but he could not judge that. He could not take that away from her. Another thought followed, a little stronger this time. Asterisk, he can mock my playing. He can insult me, but he cannot mock the music itself. Asterisk, the music was bigger than him. It was bigger than her. It was bigger than this hall and this audience and this horrible, suffocating silence. It had been written by a man who had known real suffering, real passion, and it had survived for 100 years. It didn't care about an arrogant maestro or a frightened girl. It just wanted to be felt. Something inside Anja began to shift. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic change. It was slow, like a large ship turning in the water. The hot shame was still there, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. A new emotion was beginning to push its way through, a quiet, steely resolve. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something deeper. It was a decision. She was not going to run. She was not going to let him turn her music into a joke. She was not going to let him win. But she was also not going to play to try and impress him. That was the mistake she had made before. She had been playing for their approval, for a good grade, for a career. She had forgotten the most important thing. She took a slow, deep breath, the first real breath she had taken since she walked on stage. It was a shaky breath, but it was hers. As she breathed in, she felt a little bit of the tension leave her shoulders. She was no longer playing for the maestro. She was no longer playing for the audience. She was going to play for the girl in the dusty room with the sticky key. She was going to play for the music itself. She was going to play the truth of it, the storm and the struggle and the pain, because that was what it deserved. If they hated it, so be it. If he mocked her again, so be it. But it would be real. It would be hers. Slowly, deliberately, Anja straightened her back. She lifted her chin. She looked at the keys, but this time they were not a blur of terror. They were just keys, tools. Waiting, she lifted her hands and placed them back on the ivory. Her fingers no longer trembling, but poised and ready. The silence in the hall was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the silence of pity. It was the silence of anticipation. She could feel it. The whole room was holding its breath, waiting to see what the frightened little girl would do next. And Anja knew exactly what she was going to do. She was going to stop being a frightened little girl. The first note that came from the piano was not the same note that had started her performance before. It was a completely different sound. It was not hesitant or fearful. It was a single, clear, strong note that cut through the heavy silence of the hall like a shard of glass. It was a statement. It was an answer. Anja's fingers, which had felt like strangers just moments ago, were now her own again. They were no longer just pressing keys. They were speaking a language. And what they were saying was, I am still here. The music that followed was not the polite, correct performance from before. It was a raw, living thing. It was a storm. Anja was no longer thinking about the notes or the technique or the possibility of making a mistake. All of that was gone. She was pouring every single emotion she had felt in the last hour into the music. The humiliation she had suffered became the thundering, angry bass notes that rumbled through the hall like an approaching tempest. The shame became the sharp staccato accents, like lashes of rain against a window. The maestro's mocking laughter was echoed in a series of dark, minor chords that were filled with a bitter sarcasm. She was not just playing the piece anymore. She was living it. The music was no longer a story about a storm in some distant, imaginary place. It was her storm. It was the chaos in her own heart, unleashed. Her body moved with the music, a slight sway at first, then a deeper, more physical movement. She leaned into the piano, her fingers flying across the keys with a speed and power that she had never accessed before. It was as if the humiliation had burned away all her inhibitions, all her fears, leaving behind only the pure, unfiltered core of her passion. The audience, which had been a pit of pitying eyes, was now completely captivated. They leaned forward in their seats, their mouths slightly open. The shift was so sudden, so absolute, that it was breathtaking. They were no longer watching a student being judged. They were witnessing a transformation. They were hearing a story, a deeply personal and painful story, told without a single word. The silence in the hall was no longer awkward or heavy. It was a sacred space, filled completely by the sound of the piano. No one dared to breathe too loudly for fear of breaking the spell. The old woman with pearls had a hand over her heart. The stern man in the suit had forgotten all about his notebook, his pen frozen in his hand. Even the maestro was stunned. He sat in his chair, his body perfectly still, his icy blue eyes wide with a disbelief that was slowly turning into awe. He had seen thousands of students in his long career. He had heard countless technically perfect performances, but he had never heard anything like this. This was not technique. This was not practice. This was something else entirely. This was truth. He had told her to show some feeling, and she was showing him a feeling so raw and powerful it was almost frightening. He had tried to break her, but instead he had unlocked something inside her, something wild and magnificent. He, the great judge, the master critic, was now the one who was silent, the one who was learning. The music swelled, rising to a crescendo that was so loud, so full of rage and defiance, that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the old concert hall. Anja's hands were a blur of motion, her hair falling across her face as she threw her entire being into the sound. This was her scream. This was her fight. This was her telling the maestro, telling the world that they could mock her. They could humiliate her, but they could not take her music away from her. It was a part of her, as much as her own blood and bones. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The music softened, transitioning into a delicate, haunting melody. It was the eye of the hurricane. The sound was now quiet, fragile, and filled with a deep, aching sadness. It was the sound of her loneliness, the long hours of practice, the feeling of being misunderstood. It was the memory of the girl in the dusty room playing for herself. The notes hung in the air like teardrops, each one filled with a poignant beauty that was almost unbearable. The audience was spellbound, some with tears now streaming down their faces. They were not just listening to a piano piece. They were experiencing a human soul laid bare. Anja played this quiet part with a newfound tenderness. The anger had spent itself, and what was left was a quiet strength, a resilient peace. She was no longer fighting. She had accepted the pain, the humiliation, and the struggle, and had woven it all into the music. She had found her voice. Then the final passage began. The music started to build again, but this time it was not the angry storm from before. It was something different. It was a rising tide of hope, of triumph. It was the sound of a spirit that had been broken and had put itself back together, stronger than before. The chords were major now, bright and powerful, filled with a sense of hard-won victory. Her fingers danced across the keys, not with the desperate fury of before, but with a confident, joyful energy. She was no longer the frightened girl. She was a musician. She reached the final, powerful chord. Her hands came down on the keys with a force that was both decisive and controlled. The sound that erupted was immense, a glorious, resonant wave of sound that filled every corner of the hall. And then it faded, leaving a single, perfect note hanging in the air for what seemed like an eternity. And then nothing. The final note disappeared, and the room fell silent. It was not the silence that follows a performance, the brief pause before the applause begins. It was a profound, absolute, stunned silence. It was a silence so complete that it felt like a physical presence. No one moved. No one clapped. No one even seemed to be breathing. The entire audience, the maestro, everyone, was frozen in place, completely overwhelmed by what they had just heard. The only sound in the entire hall was the quiet, ragged breathing of the young woman at the piano, her shoulders slumping as the last of her energy left her. Anja sat with her hands still on the keys, her head bowed, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had given them everything, and in return, they had given her their complete and utter silence. It was the most powerful ovation she had ever received. The silence in the hall was a living thing. It had weight and texture, a thick, heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all light and sound. Anja sat at the piano, her body slumped in exhaustion, her head bowed. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance had vanished, leaving behind a hollow, trembling emptiness. She could hear the sound of her own ragged breathing, loud in the stillness. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She expected a sharp, sarcastic comment from the maestro. Or worse, the polite, pitying applause that is given to someone who has tried their best but failed. She was preparing herself to stand up, to make the long walk of shame back to her seat, to gather her things and disappear forever. The silence felt like a verdict, a final, damning judgment. Then, from somewhere in the middle rows, a sound broke the spell. It was a small, sharp gasp, like someone had been holding their breath for far too long and could no longer stand it. It was a tiny human sound in the vast sacred space, but it was enough. It was like a single pebble starting an avalanche. A moment later, an elderly man in the front row slowly rose to his feet. He wasn't clapping. He was just standing, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes fixed on the stage. Then a woman next to him stood up too, and then another. It was a silent, slow-motion wave of respect that spread through the entire hall. And then the dam broke. A single person began to clap, a loud, sharp sound that was quickly joined by another, and another, until the sound grew into a deafening roar. The entire audience was on their feet, their applause not polite or pitying, but thunderous, ecstatic, and overwhelming. It was a wall of sound that hit Anja with the force of a physical blow. She slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. The dark void of the audience was now a sea of standing figures, their faces illuminated by the stage lights, their expressions a mixture of awe, joy, and tears. They were not just clapping. They were cheering, shouting brava, an encore. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake the very air around her. For a moment, just stared, unable to process what was happening. This was not the reaction she had prepared for. This was not shame or pity. This was triumph. The reality of it slowly washed over her, and a fresh wave of tears filled her eyes. But these were not the tears of humiliation from before. These were tears of relief, of release, of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She slowly stood up on shaky legs, turned to face the audience, and bowed. The applause only grew louder. She bowed again, her hand over her heart, trying to thank them, to give something back for the incredible gift they were giving her. She felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. These people, these strangers, had understood. They had heard her story in the music, and they had accepted it. Through the blur of tears and the blinding stage lights, she saw a figure moving from the front table. It was the maestro. He walked towards the stage, and a hush began to fall over the crowd as they turned to see what he would do. He climbed the stairs and walked towards her, his face no longer a mask of icy arrogance. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment Anja tensed, fearing one last cruel twist of the knife. But he just looked at her, his pale blue eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It was a deep, profound respect. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that was more powerful than any speech. Then he turned and walked to the microphone. The hall was completely silent now, everyone hanging on his next words. He looked out at the audience for a long moment, then back at Anja. He cleared his throat. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of all its earlier harshness. "There is nothing I can teach you," he said, his words carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. "There is nothing I can say that you have not already said with your music." He paused, looking directly at her. "Thank you." It was only 2 words, but coming from him, they were an apology, a surrender, and a crown of victory, all at once. He then stepped away from the microphone and walked off the stage, leaving Anja alone in the spotlight, the undisputed champion of the day. When Anja finally left the stage, the world outside the spotlight had changed. As she walked down the aisle, people reached out to touch her arm, to whisper words of congratulations and admiration. The pitying glances were gone, replaced by looks of reverence. A kind-faced woman with tears in her eyes simply squeezed her hand and said, "Thank you for that." Anja was no longer the scholarship student from a small town. She was the girl who had faced a dragon and had not only survived, but had turned it into a song. Officials from the conservatory, who had previously ignored her, now surrounded her, talking about future performances, about opportunities, about a career that was suddenly, miraculously, beginning in the weeks and months that followed. The story of that day became a legend in the classical music world. It was told in practice rooms in conservatories, a tale passed down from one generation of musicians to the next. It wasn't just about a brilliant performance. It was about the power of the human spirit. It became known as the Vienna silence, the moment when a hall full of people was so moved by music that they forgot how to applaud. The story was a testament to the idea that true artistry doesn't come from flawless technique or the approval of the powerful. It comes from a place of truth, from the courage to be vulnerable, to turn your deepest pain and humiliation into something beautiful that can connect us all. Anja Petrova's career was launched that day, not by a glowing review from a famous critic, but by the stunned silence of 1,000 people and the quiet, respectful surrender of the greatest maestro of them all. She went on to become a world-renowned pianist, famous for the deep, raw emotion in her playing. But she never forgot the girl on the stage that day, or the rickety upright piano with the sticky C-sharp key back home. Because it was that girl, with all her fears and all her dreams, who had finally found her voice, and in doing so had taught a master the true meaning of music.